The morning sun peeked through the mountains as Lei Mei stood at her wooden doorstep, watching her husband pack his bags. The year was 2005, and their small village was slowly waking up to another day of farm work and simple living. She could still remember the night before, how Zhang Wei had announced his decision to leave for the big city over their modest dinner of rice and vegetables. The city needs workers, he had said, his eyes bright with dreams of wealth. Chen from the next village made enough money to buy his family a new house in just 2 years. His words hung in the air like morning mist, full of promise but destined to fade away. Lei Mei was only 23 then, her face still holding the softness of youth. She had married Zhang Wei 3 years ago, following their parents' arrangement and the traditional matchmaker's blessing. Their life wasn't perfect, but they had built something meaningful together, a small farm with vegetables, some chickens, and 2 pigs they had raised from piglets. That morning, as Zhang Wei shouldered his worn backpack, he made promises that would echo in Lei Mei's mind for years to come. "I'll send money every month," he said, adjusting the straps. "We'll build a bigger house, buy more land. Maybe even get one of those new tractors everyone talks about." Lei Mei nodded quietly, her hands busy preparing a small package of steamed buns for his journey. Her mother-in-law watched from the corner, her weathered face showing both worry and hope. The old woman had lived through harder times and understood the allure of city dreams. "Take care of my parents," Zhang Wei said, accepting the food package. "I'll call when I reach the city." He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed every word he said, even if life had other plans in store. The village path that led to the main road was lined with other families who had gathered to see him off. Old Wan, who ran the only small shop in the village, gave Zhang Wei a packet of cigarettes for the journey. "Don't forget where you came from, young man," he said, his voice carrying the weight of having seen many young people leave, some never to return. As the bus approached, kicking up dust on the unpaved road, Lei Mei felt a strange tightness in her chest. She watched her husband climb aboard, his figure becoming smaller as the bus wound its way down the mountain road. The red tail lights disappeared around a bend, leaving behind a village that seemed somehow quieter than before. The days that followed settled into a routine. Lei Mei would wake before sunrise to tend to the farm, then help her in-laws with their daily needs. Her mother-in-law's arthritis made it difficult to do household chores, so Lei Mei took on those responsibilities too. She learned to ignore the whispers of village women who gathered at the well, their voices a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Zhang Wei's first letter arrived 3 weeks later, full of descriptions about the big city and its endless opportunities. He wrote about the tall buildings that touched the clouds, streets that stayed bright all night, and the constant buzz of activity that made their village life seem like a distant memory. The promised money came too, at first, enough to buy some seeds for the next planting season and medicine for his father's cough. Lei Mei would carefully store the extra in a tin box beneath their bed, dreaming of the future Zhang Wei had painted. But as summer faded into autumn, the letters grew shorter, the money transfers less frequent. Lei Mei found herself stretching every yuan, picking extra vegetables to sell at the weekly market, and learning to mend clothes that she would have previously replaced. His parents tried to hide their disappointment, but Lei Mei could see it in the way his father would sit by the window each evening, watching the road that led to the bus stop. His mother stopped mentioning Zhang Wei's name during meals, as if speaking it might make his absence more real. 1 year turned into 2, and the letters became rare treasures. Lei Mei kept them all in a small wooden box, sometimes reading them late at night when sleep wouldn't come. The words remained the same, but their meaning had changed. What once read like promises now felt like stories from a book about someone else's life. The tin box under the bed grew lighter, but Lei Mei's shoulders grew stronger. She learned to plow the fields herself, to negotiate with seed sellers, and to care for sick animals without calling the expensive vet from town. Each new skill was another small step away from the young woman who had stood watching a bus disappear around a mountain bend. In the quiet moments between work and sleep, when the mountain air turned cool and stars began to appear, Lei Mei would sit on her doorstep. Sometimes she'd catch herself looking down the same road where the bus had disappeared, not sure anymore whether she was hoping to see someone return or gathering strength to walk that road herself someday. 5 years after Zhang Wei's departure, the small farm had begun to whisper secrets of possibility to Lei Mei. It started one spring morning when she noticed wild tea plants growing on the hillside behind their house. She remembered her grandmother's stories about the premium tea that once grew in these mountains before people abandoned the old ways for quick-growing vegetables. The discovery sparked something in Lei Mi that had been dormant since her husband left. She began spending her evenings studying tea cultivation from a one book she borrowed from old Mr. Liu, who had once been a tea master before age curved his back and stiffened his fingers. Tea needs patience, old Mr. Liu told her one afternoon, his eyes crinkling as he examined the wild plants she had shown him. Much like life itself, he taught her how to recognize the best leaves, sharing knowledge passed down through generations. These mountains, he said, tapping his walking stick against the soil, they remember how to grow the finest tea in the province. Lei Mi's mother-in-law watched from their porch as her daughter-in-law started clearing small patches of land on the hillside. What will the neighbors say? She worried aloud, but her hands still helped Lei Mi sort seeds in the evenings. The old woman had softened over the years, perhaps seeing in Lei Mi the daughter she never had. The first season was hard. Lei Mi learned that tea plants were demanding masters, requiring attention to every detail: the angle of the slope, the drainage of the soil, the direction of the wind. She would wake before dawn, back aching from the previous day's work, only to start again. Some villagers shook their heads at her efforts, whispering that she had lost her mind along with her husband. But when autumn came, and she processed her first small batch of tea leaves using techniques old Mr. Liu had taught her, something magical happened. The tea had a sweetness to it, a complexity that made even the doubtful villagers pause in appreciation. Word spread slowly at first, like water seeping through soil. A tea merchant from the nearby town tried her tea at the market and ordered all she had. His eyes widened at the first sip. "This tastes like the tea my grandfather used to talk about," he said, already counting out extra yuan for her. Lei Mi used the money to buy more seedlings and hired 2 village women to help with the planting. Mrs. Shang, whose own husband had left for the city years ago, proved to be particularly skilled at picking the tender leaves. Together, they learned to read the weather, to feel in their bones when frost might threaten their plants. Her father-in-law, though weakened by age, found new purpose in constructing bamboo shelters to protect the young tea plants. His weathered hands, which had once built houses throughout the village, now crafted delicate structures that filtered the harsh summer sun. 3 more years passed, marked by the rhythm of planting and harvesting. The hillside transformed into terraced tea gardens that drew admiring glances from passing travelers. Lei Mi had learned to trust her instincts, to listen to the land, and to believe in the worth of her work. The village, too, had changed. Where once there were whispers of pity, now there were murmurs of respect. Young women would stop by to learn from her, and she taught them willingly, remembering her own early struggles. The money she earned helped other families send their children to school in the town. One day, a sleek car drove up the bumpy village road, carrying a businessman from the city. He had tried her tea in a high-end shop and traced it back to its source. Standing in her processing room, watching her sort leaves with practiced care, he offered to buy her entire harvest in advance. "Your tea," he said, holding up a cup to the light, "it tells a story. People in the city, they're hungry for authentic things, for real connections to the land." Lei Mi considered his offer carefully, thinking of all the hands that now depended on her decisions. Mrs. Zhang and the other workers, the village women who earned extra money packaging the tea, even old Mr. Liu's grandson, who had started apprenticing with them. The businessman left with a contract signed and a promise to return. That evening, as Lei Mi sat with her in-laws for dinner, she noticed how their small house had filled with new energy. Pictures of tea competitions they had won hung beside the fading wedding photo on the wall. The tin box under the bed, once used to store Zhang Wei's dwindling remittances, now held seeds for next season's planting. Her mother-in-law reached across the table to pat her hand, a gesture that spoke of pride and acceptance. The old woman had stopped waiting for letters that never came, finding instead joy in the steady growth of their new life. As night fell over the mountain, Lei Mi walked through her tea gardens, the plants silvery in the moonlight. She thought about the young woman she had been, waiting for happiness to return on a dusty bus. That woman could never have imagined that real transformation, like the finest tea, required not just time, but also the courage to begin again. The news arrived on a humid summer morning, carried by a government car that struggled up the mountain road to Lai Mei's tea farm. The village children spotted it first, running alongside the vehicle as it wound its way through the narrow paths between the tea terraces. Mrs. Zhang, who was helping with the morning harvest, nearly dropped her basket when she saw the official-looking men step out. Lai Mei was in the processing room, checking the day's tea leaves when her mother-in-law called her outside. Two men in crisp suits stood at her gate, looking out of place among the tea plants and bamboo drying racks. One held a thick envelope in his hands. "Are you Lai Mei?" the taller man asked, consulting his papers. When she nodded, he continued, "We're here about your uncle, Mr. Chen from Hong Kong." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm sorry to inform you that he passed away last month." Lai Mei remembered Uncle Chen, though she hadn't seen him in years. He was her mother's younger brother who had left for Hong Kong decades ago and built a successful business empire. He would send red envelopes during Spring Festival when she was a child, and once visited their village in a helicopter that had the whole community talking for months. The men asked to come inside, and Lai Mei led them to her modest living room, where the afternoon sun streamed through windows that overlooked the tea gardens. Her mother-in-law hurried to prepare tea, her hands shaking slightly as she brought out their best cups. "Your uncle," the second man explained, opening his briefcase, "had no children of his own. In recent years, he had been following your progress from afar." He pulled out a newspaper article about her tea business that had appeared in a Hong Kong magazine. "He was quite impressed by what you've accomplished here." Lai Mei's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope. Inside was a letter written in her uncle's familiar characters, along with legal documents that made her head spin. The numbers seemed impossible: $50 million, properties in Hong Kong, shares in companies she had only read about. "He left everything to you," the lawyer said quietly. "He believed you would know how to use it wisely." That evening, after the lawyers left, Lai Mei sat on her porch with her mother-in-law, both still trying to process the day's events. The old woman held her hand, her grip firm despite her age. "Your uncle was right," she said softly. "You've shown wisdom in small things. You'll show wisdom in big things too." News travels fast in small villages. By nightfall, everyone knew about Lai Mei's inheritance. Old Mr. Liu hobbled over, bringing a special blend of tea he had been saving. "For celebrations," he said with a knowing smile. Mrs. Zhang and other workers gathered too, their faces showing genuine happiness for the woman who had given them dignity through honest work. But not all reactions were joyful. Some distant relatives suddenly remembered their connection to Lai Mei, appearing at her door with sad stories and hopeful smiles. Others whispered that such money would change her, that she would abandon the village just as she had been abandoned. Lai Mei spent that night unable to sleep, walking through her tea gardens under the stars. The plants seemed to whisper to her, reminding her of all the lessons they had taught her about patience and growth. She thought about her uncle, wondering if he had seen in her something she was only beginning to see in herself. The next morning, she gathered her workers and made an announcement that surprised everyone. "The tea farm will expand," she said, "but not just in size. We'll build a school here, teaching others how to grow tea the traditional way. Everyone who has worked with me will become partners, not just employees." Mrs. Zhang wiped tears from her eyes as Lai Mei continued outlining her plans. There would be better equipment, proper buildings for processing, even a small hotel for tea tourists. But most importantly, the soul of what they had built together would remain unchanged. Word of Lai Mei's inheritance spread beyond the village, traveling down the mountain and into the city. It reached the ears of those who had once doubted her, and eventually it found its way to a man who had almost forgotten the life he had left behind. In a crowded city apartment, Zhang Wei stared at his phone screen, reading and rereading the news article about the village woman who had transformed a small tea farm into a success story, only to inherit a fortune that would make her one of the richest people in the province. The photo showed Lai Mei standing among her tea plants, looking confident and at peace, a woman he barely recognized as the young wife he had left behind. As autumn approached, bringing with it the promise of the finest tea harvest yet, Lai Mei received another visit. This time it was from a young woman representing a national business magazine. "Your story inspires people," she said, taking notes as they walked through the tea gardens. The abandoned wife who never gave up, who built something meaningful, and then had fate reward her faith. Lai Mei smiled at this interpretation. Fate didn't reward faith, she said, picking a perfect tea leaf and holding it up to the light. It rewarded work, patience, and the willingness to begin again. The money isn't the real inheritance. This knowledge, these gardens, this community, that's the true fortune. Jiang Wei stepped off the bus into a village he barely recognized. 15 years had carved new roads through the mountain, replaced dirt paths with paved streets, and transformed the sleepy farming community into something that made him question if he had gotten off at the wrong stop. The old banyan tree at the village entrance was the only familiar landmark, its branches now strung with solar-powered lights. He pulled his expensive leather suitcase along the main road, drawing curious glances from passing villagers. None of them seemed to recognize him, though he had once known every face in this small community. A group of workers walked past, carrying baskets of tea leaves and chatting about production quotas. Their clothes were clean and new, their faces showing none of the desperation he remembered from his time here. The biggest shock came when he reached what should have been his old neighborhood. Where humble farmhouses once stood, he found a modern facility with glass windows and a sign that read Golden Mountain Tea Company, Main Processing Center. Young people in uniforms moved purposefully in and out, some carrying tablets and discussing shipping schedules. "Can I help you?" a young woman asked, noticing his confused expression. "Are you here for the tea tour?" Jiang Wei shook his head, his throat tight. "I'm looking for Lai Mei," he managed to say. The name felt strange on his tongue after so many years. The woman's expression changed subtly. "Mrs. Lai is in a meeting with international buyers," she said, her tone cooling. "Do you have an appointment?" Mrs. Lai. Not the simple village wife he had left behind, but someone who required appointments and held meetings with international buyers. Jiang Wei clutched his suitcase handle tighter, feeling increasingly out of place, despite his city clothes and expensive watch. He decided to walk around the village while waiting. Each step revealed another surprise. The old village school had been replaced by a modern education center with a sign advertising traditional tea culture and business training. Children played in a new playground while their parents worked in the nearby tea gardens. Near the village center, he found old Mr. Lu's grandson running a tea house that showcased premium teas to visitors from the city. The young man was explaining to customers how their tea was certified organic and had won international awards. On the wall hung a large photograph of Lai Mei receiving a business leadership award, her smile confident and genuine. "She built all this?" Jiang Wei asked an elderly woman who was sweeping the street. She looked up, and he recognized Mrs. Shang, though her hair had turned completely white. Recognition flickered in her eyes. "Well, if it isn't the wandering husband," she said, her voice carrying years of judgment. "Yes, she built this. With her own hands first, then with the hands of those who believed in her." She paused, leaning on her broom. "While you were chasing city dreams, she was making them come true right here." The afternoon sun was setting when Jiang Wei finally saw her. Lai Mei was walking through the tea gardens with a group of business people in suits. She wore a simple but elegant outfit, her hair styled professionally, her gestures assured as she explained something about the tea plants. She looked nothing like the young woman he had left behind, yet somehow exactly like who that woman was meant to become. He stood frozen, watching as she handled questions with ease, switching between Mandarin and English. The village women working nearby treated her with obvious respect, but there was also warmth in their interactions. This wasn't just a boss. This was someone who had lifted an entire community with her success. When the business group left, Lai Mei turned and finally saw him. For a moment, neither spoke. The golden evening light cast long shadows across the tea terraces, and somewhere in the distance, birds were calling their evening songs. "Jiang Wei," she said, her voice neither warm nor cold. "I wondered when the news would bring you back." He stepped forward, rehearsed words dying on his lips. How could he explain that he had come seeking his share of her inheritance when faced with all she had built? The empty promises he had planned to resurrect seemed hollow in the face of these very real achievements. "The village has changed," he managed to say. Lai Mei's smile was gentle but distant. "Everything changes," she replied. "Even people who think they'll stay the same forever." She gestured at the thriving enterprise around them. Would you like a tour of what you left behind? Or should we discuss what you really came back for? The setting sun painted the tea gardens in shades of gold and green, highlighting the neat rows that stretched up the mountainside. Workers were finishing their day's tasks, their conversations and laughter floating on the evening breeze. This was no longer the poor village he had fled from. It was a testament to what patience, hard work, and vision could create. Zhang Wei looked at his expensive suit and felt oddly shabby next to Li Mei's quiet dignity. He had come back thinking he would find an easy path to wealth, but instead found something far more valuable, a lesson about the true meaning of success and the price of abandoning one's responsibilities. The village hall had changed like everything else, its old wooden benches replaced with comfortable chairs, its walls now adorned with photographs documenting the community's transformation. It was here that Li Mei chose to meet with Zhang Wei the next morning, in the presence of the village elders who had watched their story unfold from the beginning. Old Mr. Liu sat in his place of honor, his walking stick resting against his chair. Mrs. Zhang had taken a seat near the window, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Several other elders, their faces etched with the wisdom of years, completed the circle. The morning sun streamed through new windows, casting pools of light on the polished wooden floor. "You want to claim your share of my uncle's inheritance," Li Mei said, breaking the heavy silence. It wasn't a question. She sat straight-backed in her chair, a stack of documents on the table before her. Zhang Wei shifted uncomfortably. His city confidence seemed to waver under the steady gazes of those who had known him since childhood. "As your husband," he began. "Ex-husband," old Mr. Liu interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "The divorce was finalized 5 years ago when you failed to respond to the court notices." The shock on Zhang Wei's face was genuine. "What notices?" "I never received any. They were sent to every address we could find for you," Li Mei explained, her voice steady. "Your workplace, your apartment, even your parents' old house in the city. You never responded. After 3 attempts, the court granted the divorce." Mrs. Zhang leaned forward. "Did you think she would wait forever? That the young woman you abandoned would stay frozen in time, preserved like tea leaves in a jar?" The morning light caught the silver in Li Mei's hair as she opened a folder. "Let me show you something," she said, spreading out photographs. They told a story in images, her in-laws' final years, their medical bills, their graves that she had tended faithfully. "While you were building your new life, I was caring for your parents. Your father asked for you in his final days." Zhang Wei's hands trembled as he looked at a photo of his father in a hospital bed, Li Mei at his side. "I sent money," he whispered. "The last time you sent money was 12 years ago," one of the elders spoke up. 500 yuan. "I remember because your mother cried, saying it wasn't even enough for her medicine that month." Li Mei pulled out more documents, hospital records, receipts for medical treatments, letters she had written to Zhang Wei that were returned unopened. "Your mother lived for 3 more years after your father passed. She stopped asking about you in her last year. Instead, she would hold my hand and apologize, saying she had raised a son who forgot the meaning of family." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of workers in the tea fields. Through the window, they could see the morning harvest beginning, people moving with purpose through the rows of tea plants. "I didn't come to talk about the past," Zhang Wei said, attempting to regain his composure. "The inheritance." "The inheritance is not just money," Li Mei cut in, her voice finally showing emotion. "It's every early morning I spent learning to grow tea. It's every night I stayed up caring for your sick mother. It's every lesson old Mr. Liu taught me about tea cultivation, every worker who trusted me enough to join this enterprise, every student who comes to learn our methods." She stood up and walked to the window. "Look out there. See those new buildings? They're dormitories for students who come to learn traditional tea farming. The profits help support elderly villagers who have no children to care for them. Your uncle saw what we built here, not just a business, but a community that remembers its responsibilities." The elders nodded in agreement. They had watched Li Mei transform their village from a place young people fled from into one they sought out. They had seen her turn abandonment into strength, loneliness into leadership. "I have the legal documents," Zhang Wei insisted, but his voice had lost its certainty. "As your husband at the time of your uncle's death, you were not her husband," old Mr. Liu interrupted again. The divorce was finalized 2 years before her uncle passed. But even if you had been, he paused, looking straight at Jun Wei, would you have any moral right to claim what she has built? Lai Mei returned to her seat, placing a final document on the table. It was a letter from her uncle, dated just weeks before his death. In it, he wrote of watching her progress from afar, of seeing how she had honored the true meaning of family and community. My uncle didn't leave his fortune to a poor village woman hoping to help her, Lai Mei said softly. He invested in someone who had already proven she knew how to create value, not just for herself, but for others. She met Zhang Wei's eyes. The woman you left behind doesn't exist anymore. She grew into someone else, someone who understands that real wealth isn't in bank accounts, but in the lives we touch and the legacy we build. The morning sun had climbed higher, and through the windows, they could hear the sounds of the village going about its day. Students arriving at the training center, trucks being loaded with tea for shipping, tourists gathering for the morning tea ceremony. It was the sound of a community thriving, built on the foundation of one woman's refusal to be defined by abandonment. The county courthouse stood tall against the morning sky, its modern glass windows reflecting the surrounding mountains. Inside, the air was cool and still as people filled the benches of courtroom 3. Village residents had come down the mountain in groups, their usual farming clothes replaced with their finest outfits, their faces showing support for the woman who had transformed their community. Zhang Wei sat with his city lawyer, both in expensive suits that seemed out of place among the simple dignity of the villagers. He had filed a claim against Lai Mei, demanding a portion of her inheritance based on their former marriage. His lawyer had assured him it was a simple case, but the packed courtroom suggested otherwise. Lai Mei entered quietly, wearing a simple blue dress that she had made herself years ago. Mrs. Zhang sat beside her, along with old Mr. Liu and several other village elders. Their presence spoke volumes. This wasn't just about money, but about community and justice. The judge, a woman with kind eyes and gray hair, called the court to order. Before we begin, she said, adjusting her glasses, I want to review some evidence that was submitted yesterday. On a screen at the front of the courtroom, images began to appear. The first was a medical record from 15 years ago, showing Lai Mei had taken Zhang Wei's father to the hospital late one night when he couldn't breathe. Next came receipts for medicine, each carefully preserved, showing how she had spent her tea earnings caring for her in-laws. Your Honor, Zhang Wei's lawyer began, these personal matters are not relevant to the inheritance claim. I disagree, the judge interrupted. They speak directly to the character of both parties and their contributions to the family. She turned to Zhang Wei. Can you show similar evidence of your care for your parents during this time? Zhang Wei shifted in his seat. The courtroom was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. His lawyer shuffled papers, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Then came the recordings. Lai Mei's in-laws, knowing their time was short, had asked the village doctor to record their statements. The doctor had agreed, understanding the importance of preserving the truth. Zhang Wei's father appeared on screen, his face thin but peaceful in his hospital bed. My son left, he said, his voice weak but clear, but heaven sent me a true daughter. Lai Mei never left our side. She worked in the fields all day, then sat up with us at night when we were sick. She saved the tea business money to buy our medicine. She read us letters she wrote to our son, though he never answered. His mother's recording followed. I used to cry for my son, she said, her wrinkled face showing both sadness and acceptance. But then I realized I had not lost a son. I had gained a daughter who understood the real meaning of family. The courtroom was silent as the recordings played. Some of the villagers wiped tears from their eyes, remembering the old couple who had passed away with only Lai Mei by their side. Next came financial records. They showed how Lai Mei had built the tea business from nothing, reinvesting every profit to create jobs and opportunities for the village. There were records of the school she had started, the elderly care program she had established, the scholarships she provided for village children. Your uncle left you this inheritance 2 years after your divorce was finalized, the judge noted, looking at Lai Mei. Can you tell us why you think he chose you as his heir? Lai Mei stood, her voice steady. My uncle visited the village secretly a year before he passed away. He saw what we had built here, not just a business, but a community. He told me later that he had been looking for someone who understood that true wealth comes from lifting others up, not just for self. The judge nodded, then turned to Zhang Wei. And you, sir? Where were you when your parents needed care? When your wife was building this enterprise? What claim can you make to the fruits of her labor? Zhang Wei looked around the courtroom, seeing faces he had grown up with now turned away from him in disappointment. He saw Mrs. Zhang, who had bandaged his scraped knees when he was a boy, shaking her head sadly. He saw old Mr. Liu, who had taught him to fly kites, looking at him with disappointment. He began, but for the first time, he had no clever words, no justifications. The judge's verdict was clear and firm. She not only dismissed Zhang Wei's claim to the inheritance, but ordered him to repay the costs of his parents' care with interest. This court finds that Mr. Zhang Wei abandoned his familial duties willfully and completely. The inheritance in question was granted to Li Mei as an individual 2 years after her divorce in recognition of her character and achievements. As the judge continued reading her decision, sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, falling on the simple wooden charm Li Mei wore around her neck, a gift from her mother-in-law in her final days. It had been carved from the wood of their old house, a reminder of where she had started and how far she had come. The villagers filed out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon, their faces showing relief and satisfaction. Justice had been served, not just for Li Mei, but for every person who had ever chosen to stay, to build, to care for others when it would have been easier to leave. The morning after the court verdict, Li Mei stood at the highest point of her tea garden, watching the sun rise over the mountains. The air was crisp with autumn's first breath, and below her, the village was coming to life. She could see workers heading to the processing facility, students gathering at the training center, and elderly villagers starting their morning exercises in the new community park. Yesterday's events felt like the closing of a long chapter. Zhang Wei had left the courthouse without a word, disappearing into a waiting car that carried him back to the city. Some said they saw tears in his eyes as he took one last look at the village he had once called home. But Li Mei hadn't watched him leave. She was already focused on tomorrow. "Teacher Lai," called a young voice. A group of students from the agricultural training program was climbing up the path toward her, notebooks in hand. They were daughters of farmers from neighboring villages, here to learn the art of tea cultivation and sustainable farming. Their eyes shone with the same determination she had felt when she first started her journey. "Today, we're going to learn about reading the weather," Li Mei told them, pointing to the clouds gathering around the mountain peaks. "Our ancestors knew how to predict rain by watching nature signs. This knowledge is as valuable as any modern forecast." As she taught, Mrs. Zhang appeared with a thermos of morning tea. She had insisted on continuing to help with the daily operations, saying, "Just because we won in court doesn't mean the work stops." The old woman now ran the community kitchen that fed students and workers, but cooking famous throughout the region. Later that morning, Li Mei visited the new elderly care center being built near the village square. It would be named after her in-laws, a place where older villagers could live in comfort and dignity. The construction workers tipped their hats as she inspected the progress, proud to be part of something meaningful. "My son asked to enroll in the training program," one worker told her, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "He was planning to leave for the city, but after seeing what you've built here, he wants to learn how to create something similar in our village." In her office, Li Mei found a stack of letters from other communities requesting guidance on starting their own sustainable farming projects. Her story had spread beyond the mountains, inspiring others to look for value in what they had rather than chasing distant dreams. Old Mr. Liu visited in the afternoon, his grandson pushing his wheelchair through the gardens. "You've done what many thought impossible," he said, breathing in the familiar scent of tea leaves. "You've made our children proud to stay." Li Mei smiled, remembering how he had taught her to read the tea leaves years ago. "We did it together," she replied. "Every person who stayed, who believed, who worked, they're all part of this story." That evening, she hosted a community dinner in the village square. Tables were laden with local dishes, and everyone had brought something to share. Children ran between the tables, their laughter mixing with the adults' conversations. Young couples who had recently decided to return to the village after university sat with elderly farmers, sharing dreams and wisdom across generations. A young girl tugged at Lai Mei's sleeve. "Tell us the story," she begged. "About how you made the tea garden." Other children gathered around, sitting cross-legged on the ground, their faces eager in the lantern light. Lai Mei looked at their bright eyes and saw the future. "It's not just my story," she began. "It's a story about believing in what you have, about finding strength in your roots. Sometimes the best treasures are right where you are, you just have to be patient enough to help them grow." As she spoke, she noticed some of the adults listening to, nodding at parts they remembered living through. Mrs. Zhang wiped a tear when Lai Mei mentioned the early days of struggling to learn tea cultivation. Old Mr. Lu's grandson squeezed his grandfather's hand when she spoke about the wisdom of the village elders. The night grew deeper, and lanterns swayed gently in the mountain breeze. Someone started playing a traditional song on an old ohu, its haunting melody carrying across the square. Younger villagers joined in with modern instruments, creating a new harmony that bridged generations. Looking around at the faces lit by lantern light, Lai Mei saw not just a community, but a family, one that had grown from the ashes of abandonment into something strong and beautiful. The inheritance from her uncle had helped, but the real treasure was what they had built before it arrived: trust, determination, and the courage to believe in their own worth. A shooting star streaked across the mountain sky, and the children made wishes. Lai Mei closed her eyes too, not to wish but to give thanks. Thanks for the hardships that had taught her strength, for the people who had believed in her, and for the chance to show that sometimes the greatest journey isn't to a distant city, but to the heart of what matters most. The story of the abandoned wife who built an empire would be told for generations in these mountains. But for Lai Mei, the real story was in the everyday moments, in the morning dew on tea leaves, in the proud smile of a student mastering a new skill, in the peaceful sleep of elderly villagers knowing they were cared for, and in the laughter of children who would grow up knowing they didn't have to leave home to find their worth.